Roman family. I'm looking at the bottom of page 135, but turning over to page 136. The Roman family at first was with a father head called in Italian or in Roman, in Latin, the pater family, with the father as the head. And the father had so much authority over his children, he could even have his children killed if he wanted to. And King Herod had 3 of his 6 sons killed, so much so that Caesar Augustus, when he signed the death order for the last one, said, "I'd rather be Herod's hog than Herod's son." In Latin, the word hog was similar to the word for son. Anyway, but as time went on, the Roman fathers lost that authority. In fact, as time went on, more and more the role of the father became less and less, and the wife got more and more authority.
Why was that?
All right. That's an extremely good question. Really glad you asked it. Now, one thing you cannot explain is the whys. However, what you can do is speculate. I mean, there's real events, something that happened, and there's speculation as to why did it happen. Why did it happen? Supposedly, folks, the Roman people got a little bit more civilized and more enlightened as time went on, and decided, hey, it's just not right to have the father be able to kill his children, and also the fathers were once children themselves, and as they grew up, they thought, hey, you know, I mean, I'm speculating. My father could have killed me, but I'm going to make sure that can't happen again. But also, now this is going to sound really negative, but you jumped at the gun a little bit. As the authority of the father weakened, the whole empire declined. In other words, they supposedly thought they were advancing and progressing and becoming more and more enlightened. Instead, they were setting the stage for the big downfall that was to come, as the family life broke into pieces. Now, something that the earlier versions of your book hinted at, and almost every Roman history book you'll read will tell you, when the Roman Empire started, during the days of the early Republic, divorce was very uncommon. Young men and young women married and stayed married for life. Then came the wars. The wars broke up family life. And eventually you had an increase in the number of unmarried adults, an increase in the number of bachelors, an increase in the number of old maids.
With the number of marriages, though, weren't there a lot of people that remained unfaithful, though?
Now you had that too. In other words, infidelity became commonplace. It wasn't at first. Infidelity became commonplace. Divorce became extremely commonplace. Your book mentions Cicero's daughter, who was married at 16, widowed at about 22, remarried again a year later, divorced at 28, and died at 32 alone. This was so typical, and it was said that a lot of times a woman would marry a man, leave him for another man, leave him for another man, leave him for another man, but then wind up later in her life back with her original husband. That she realized that, hey, I was better off there than I was anywhere else. So, but divorce was very uncommon at first. But as morality broke down, divorce became more common. Now, folk, I want to remind you, again, the first paper I wrote in high school is American Society Following the Footsteps of the Roman Empire. I want you to see for yourself, I mean, are we following Rome? I mean, I recently heard someone say that the United States is a continuation of the Roman Empire. When Rome fell, the church tried to keep the Roman Empire revived by setting up a political entity called the Holy Roman Empire. When that fell, about the time it fell, the United States was born. And the United States has an institution called a Senate. We have veto power. We have domes like the Capitol. And we're the continuation of what was the original Roman Empire in a different locale. But are we following in the path of the Roman Empire in more ways than one? Now, I want to remind you, in our country today, 1 out of every 2 grown adults in this country is unmarried, and in some of the bigger cities it's even worse than that. is this bad or good? Again, I'm going to make further comments on that question later. But what happened in Roman times, your men and women stopped liking each other. Now, why was this? Okay, I'm going to jump ahead of this stuff. What I'm saying now, I'm going to repeat later in the lesson. Mankind's worst enemy is not war, is not pestilence, is not famine. Mankind's worst enemy appears to be peace and prosperity. How's that? In time of peace and prosperity, people become lazy, non-productive, not careful, and head right smack dab headlong into disaster. All right, you might think war kills people. On a personal note, somewhat personal, war brings in more people and takes out. When the war is over and the men return home, they start having children like crazy. It's always been this way. My father, his father had served in World War I, so my father was a war baby. I was a war baby from World War II. The soldiers returned home and had children like crazy. And this occurred not just in the United States, it occurred in Italy, in Germany, in France, in Great Britain, and even in Japan. And oftentimes they'll name their babies after relatives who were lost. Had an uncle named Calvin who disappeared flying over the Adriatic Sea, getting ready to bomb Germany. Never heard from again. So one of my cousins is named after my uncle Calvin. My dad would have named one of us Calvin, except that the name had already been taken by his sister, who had a son. The first grandson my grandfather had was named after his missing son, Calvin. And again, a lot of times people name their children after fallen war veterans. So war, again, brings in more people than it takes out. Peace, people start, all right, I'll speak blunt with you. The men stop being men and the women stop being women, and the men and women hate each other.
Wouldn't it be the times of peace where they actually had the kids, because that's when the war ended?
Oh, in the time, yeah, right after the war.
I mean, that's
but
when
it
the
ends,
population boomed.
yeah, that's when the population boomed, when the war ended. But then they stopped having them shortly thereafter. Right? There was a big boom. The baby boom of the 1950s, right after World War II, from 1940, did not last. We started practicing birth control, abortion, and other means of, and also the young people not even getting married at all. Abstinence, you might call it. In the land of Japan, it is so bad that if the Japanese don't change their ways, they're going to become extinct within a matter of 40 or 50 years.
What do you mean it's so bad? Like they're not?
What's that? Safe? Okay, yeah. In other words, yeah, okay, granted, the children come in time of peace, but it's right after the war, for the war veterans. The children of the war veterans, namely people in my generation, and I've got to quit, just simply do not have as much on the ball. Oftentimes they're spoiled rotten, given everything they want, everything they need, and I'm talking about my own generation, and wind up taking the streets, burning their draft cards, rioting, tearing up college campuses, taking over the student center. Yes, I did not do this myself. Neither did my brothers or sisters or cousins, but a lot of the young people of my generation did just that. Some of you may have heard. All right. That's what a lot of us grew up to become. Anyone else have any comment? The class this morning was so sleepy. But, all right, anyway, this one, more awake. All right. Anyway, the Romans, like the United States, got to where they wouldn't serve in the army. And the Roman government had to hire soldiers, and they wound up hiring not Roman citizens, but mostly foreigners to make up the army. We aren't there yet, but folks, can you imagine if the United States government started hiring Mexicans and Guatemalans and French and to make up the American army? Yes?
That's actually what Obama wants to do. He wants to hire mercenaries. Just
This,
saying.
yeah, okay, this I have, this is a start, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, yeah. This is a start, this is something that's only come up in the last few weeks. but he wants to hire mercenaries. And folk, I'll tell you something about mercenaries. When the going gets tough, the mercenaries go running. They only fight in times of what Thomas Paine called the summer soldier, the sunshine patriot. And when the going gets tough, the mercenaries get going, and I don't mean going after the enemy, going from the enemy. You cannot win with mercenaries. Hey, King George III hired mercenaries against us. And guess what, folk? All of you know this. I hope you do. He lost. But he hired mercenaries, Hessian German mercenaries to fight us. And he lost. All right. Again, a lot of young girls were forced into marriage as young as 16 or sometimes younger. Slaves. Most of your slaves were soldiers from foreigners, foreign soldiers who had been captured in war, and they would be taken as slaves for a while, or they might be bad people who would be punished, or persons who were in debt, or, and this was something that happened in the early days of the empire, fathers would get in debt and sell their children to be slaves. Now, eventually, this practice was outlawed. As your book, I didn't mention that, but in a previous section, the practice of sons being sold as slaves to pay off their father's debts was eventually outlawed. Now, what happened as time went on? There were no more wars. That meant there were no more captured slaves. The prisoners would only serve as slaves maybe 10, 15, or 20 years and be freed. Even the prisoners of war would be turned loose after a few years. What happened was, as time went on, there came to be no slaves. And this was really hard on family life because Roman women felt like, hey, we shouldn't have to work. It's for the low classes. And all of a sudden they find themselves waking up one day and having to turn their slave loose. He'd served his time. And her husband couldn't afford another one because there were so few slaves. The price of it had gone way, way up. And she'd have to do the housework herself. And a lot of times, rather than do that, she'd say, hey, I can't put up with this. She'd wind up leaving him. And oftentimes couldn't find a better man for it. Slavery still went on. By late in the empire, the practice of slavery was outlawed. And as Europe went into the Dark Ages, they didn't have slaves, they had something else called serfs, which we'll talk about later. But the serf, the only difference between a serf and a slave was a serf could not be bought or sold. The slave could. So for hundreds of years, slavery was outlawed in Europe. Then it came back on the scene again when Africans became enslaved. Now, in the United States, for the first couple hundred years of our existence, actually from 1619 to 1865, slavery was part of our scene. But the Romans were never as racist about it as we were. In other words, a slave could be a former Roman citizen or a son of a Roman citizen. They enslaved the Romans, they enslaved Greeks, they enslaved anybody, not just one race of people or people from one nationality. Now back to family life. Again, this is a difficult subject, and I'm going to try to talk about it in a completely morally neutral light. But the Romans became more homosexual as time went on, and they blamed it on the Greeks and said, we bought these Greek slaves, and they practiced this back in Greece, and they made us this way. And they blamed the Greeks for their tendency toward homosexuality. Now, I'll drop that subject in a moment for the rest of the day. The Roman families also, the men and women began to look for three things in a marriage partner, and see if this reminds you of 21st century America. They valued highly looks, personality, and money. Now, I've got something to tell you about these three things. Not any one of these three have anything at all to do with making a marriage work. Now, if you don't believe me, ask Ted Turner. And I could say ask Elizabeth Taylor, except she's deceased. Ted Turner, though, when his last wife left him, Jane Fonda, her name, he said, I wish somebody would tell me how to make a marriage work. maybe if you were a whole lot poorer, and folks, it happened in Roman times, the richer they were, it's just those, the more likely they were to divorce. Why is that hard to understand? It's hard to understand, but folks, the statistics are there.